Have a good number in attendance this morning. Appreciate that very much. As always, it's good to be able to look out at the audience and see visitors among us. We hope and pray that we can encourage you. If there's any questions you might have, we invite those. We would love to be able to sit down and study the Scriptures with you, for in the Scriptures we believe we have eternal life as we follow those things which God has given to us as being life in and of itself. And so for us here, the second Sunday morning of each month is a time that we set aside to do an OSH lesson, or our spiritual heritage lesson. It's the lesson that our young people are studying in their class to help the whole family to gather around to go through these familiar stories and accounts that we have in the Scriptures of the events of the times past where people were of great success in God's kingdom. This quarter, they're talking about God being good at light and water. And this morning, we're going to see how God uses water as a test to divide those he wants to go into this particular battle and those he does not. And there's been many times in the Scripture where God has used water in order to put people to the test. You remember in the land of Egypt that when the plagues were beginning, that God turned the water into blood, but it was not so with the water among his children, but only among the Egyptians. We see that as they were coming out of bondage, that God used water to make a dividing line between his children who walked through the Red Sea on dry ground and the Egyptians who were buried in water. And even in the New Testament, we see that God still uses water as that great dividing test. Those who are his children, those who have been immersed in that watery grave of baptism, to arise to walk in newness of life, and those who refuse to do so in submission to his will. And so when we think about Gideon's 300, it's an amazing story, and it's one, as Nathan said, it does stand out, especially in the minds of our children, because it is such a remarkable account. There's more in the Scriptures. There are more Scriptures that are given to Gideon than any of the other judges, which I thought was amazing the first time that I read that. But Gideon is given to us, I believe, as a story to show us that God can use pretty much anyone, so long as we're willing to do God's will. And it doesn't matter where we came from, our family lineage. It doesn't matter the profession that we had in times past. It doesn't even matter that we may be fearful and have some trepidations about doing God's will. So long as we're willing to do God's will, God is able to use us. And those are some of the things we'll see in the lesson. So if you're ready for your 3 words, another tradition we have is holding up your notebooks. Let me see them. Very good. Okay, your 3 words for this morning are potential. Because with Gideon, we do see that he has potential, even though he may not recognize it at the very beginning. We're going to talk about qualifications when we get to the 300. And I want to make some points about that when it comes to the idea of being qualified to do God's work. And also victory. When we trust in God, that's where we have victory. And God is the one who provides it. And so this lesson is really all about this battle being 100% the Lord's and 0% the people. But God still uses them to do and to accomplish and bring about his victory in that. And so let's begin. In the history of Israel, and during this time period of the judges, you don't have a king over the land, even though there are some who try to exalt themselves to a position of king. You have judges instead. And they go through several different cycles where people are doing what is right in their own eyes. And if you want to remember this cycle that they go through, A, B, C, D, and E are a good way to remember the cycle that they go through. A being apostasy. They will fall away from God. When they fall away into God, they go B. They fall into bondage. And God sends them into bondage that they might be affronted and confronted with the fact that because of their unfaithfulness, God is going to punish them for their sins. While they are there, it brings realization to many of them. So C, they begin to cry out to the Lord. When they cry out to the Lord does hear them, because this is why he sent them into bondage in the first place. And so then they have a deliverer. So D, there's deliverance that is given to the people by at the hand of one of the judges. But then when they are brought out of that bondage and they are delivered from the oppression that they're going through, then they go through times of prosperity or times of ease. And in those times of ease, that's where they go back to the beginning and they apostatize once again. And so that's a good way to kind of remember what's going on. When we get to Judges chapter 6, that is what has happened. The children of Israel have been through about 3 different time periods of bondage. And you would think that by now they would have learned the lessons that God wanted them to learn, but they had not. If you go back to the last verse of chapter 5, at the very end of that verse, it says the land had rest for 40 years. And so for 40 years they had had rest, and in that 40 years they managed to undo everything that the previous generation had done. All the prosperity and all the wealth and all the good things that they had were now gone. And when you get to chapter 6, you see that they are once again sinning, and they're once again turning their back on God, and they are once again being oppressed. And so in chapter 6 and verse 1, the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord delivered them into the hand of Midian for 7 years. And the hand of Midian prevailed against Israel because of the Midianites. The children of Israel made for themselves the dens, the caves, and the strongholds which are in the mountains. So it was whenever Israel had sown that the Midianites would come up, also Amalekites, and the people of the east would come up against them, and they would encamp against them and destroy the produce of the earth as far as Gaza, and leave no sustenance for Israel, neither sheep, nor ox, nor donkey. For they would come up with their livestock and their tents coming in as numerous as locusts. Even in chapter 7, it's going to say that when they looked out over the armies of the Midianites, they looked at as locusts consuming the land. Both though they and their camels were without number, and they would enter the land to destroy it. So Israel was greatly impoverished because of the Midianites, and the children of Israel cried out to the Lord. So one of the first things that we see when we think about Gideon and who he is, even from the very beginning, is that God is able to use tough times in order to get our attention. Whenever you're going through difficulties and tough times, that's usually when it's a lot easier for you to fall to your knees and cry out to God. When times are well, when things are going well, those are times where maybe we will thank God occasionally, but we are not as intense often in our prayers in good times as we are in the bad. Israel's going through some bad times. They've abandoned their homes and are living in caves and dens in the mountains. Whenever they sow anything, the Midianites and the Amalekites, they come in and they destroy all of it. They eat it all up. And then as they're leaving the land, they destroy it, not just simply because they're trying to not leave anything for Israel, but because of all those many people leaving the land, trampling those things under their feet. So when we come to Gideon, it's no wonder that we see him hiding in order to thresh his wheat, that he doesn't want to be seen and he doesn't want it to be stolen. In 2 Corinthians 1 and verse 9, Paul makes mention of the fact that they had the sentence of death on themselves. And speaking of while he was preaching and teaching in various areas and going through the different things he went through, and at the end of that verse it says, so that we might learn to trust in God. That's where Israel has once again come. They've got the sentence of death upon them, but it's because God is wanting them to trust in him and not in themselves. And so God is one who is going to look upon this Gideon in verse 11. The angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth tree, which was at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, while his son Gideon threshed wheat in the winepress in order to hide it from the Midianites. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, the Lord is with you, you mighty man of valor. And that's a verse that's always stood out to me. You mighty man of valor. He's hiding. Mighty man of valor. And he tells him, I'm going to deliver Israel by your hand. And Gideon's like, how can you even say that you're with us? Because if you're with us, then why are we going through all these things? But Gideon, you're the one that's going to deliver these. Well, how can I do that? Because I am the least in my father's house, who is the least of all the tribes. Notice, if you will, in verse 15, O my Lord, how can I save Israel? Indeed, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house. So God is going to use this farmer who is hiding, who is of the least of the tribes, and who is the least of the tribe that he's in. And not only that, but when you go later in this chapter, you'll see about verse 25 or so, that not only is he the least in all these things, but his father is an idol worshiper. And he's told to go and destroy your father's altar and build another altar instead. And people are wanting to kill him as a result of this thing. And God's going to use him. The point of this is that when you think about Gideon, God is able to see the best in every person. That Gideon is one that not only is he the least, not only is his father an idol worshiper, but Gideon is someone who struggles with doubts. He asked this angel, how can I know that you are real? And he asks for signs. After the sign is given, and after he destroys his father's altar and builds another altar to the Lord, He again, after he has 4 tribes join him to go into this battle against the Midianites, he still once again says and has this test of the fleece. And that's not just once but twice for signs concerning this fleece and the dew that's on it. Gideon's one who we're going to see is fearful. Because God says if you don't want to go up and listen and observe the Midianites by yourself, then take with you Purah, your servant, with you. And the next verse said, so he took Purah with him. And it shows that he was fearful when he went up to hear the dream of this Midianite. So you have someone who does not know his own potential, but God does. One of the worst lies, brethren, that we tell ourselves is that God can only use special people. And that's simply not true. God uses the least. God uses people whose fathers were idolaters. God uses people that others despise and maybe even want to destroy. God uses people who are just really not sure and deal with doubts and fears. And God uses them. The point is that God sees more in you than you may see in yourself. God knows exactly what you're capable of because it is He who is with you and not you yourself. Think about who you are. God has given to us, it tells us in 1 Peter 1 and verse 3, He has given to us all things that pertain to life and godliness. So think about who you are. We're told in the Scriptures that we are children of God. What manner of love has been bestowed on us that we should be children of God? You're a child of God. You are someone who is His friend because you do His will. Ephesians tells us that because we're saved by grace through faith, that we're God's workmanship. We're told that we are being justified in Romans chapter 5. And in Romans chapter 8, because of that, there's no condemnation that falls upon us because of that. We're told in the Scriptures in Ephesians chapter 1 that we're adopted into the family of God. And because of that, our citizenship is in heaven in Philippians chapter 3. We're told that God is one that loves us so much that nothing can separate us from His love in Romans chapter 8. Over and over and over again, the Scriptures tell us who we are. What Gideon's going to do is take the children of Israel, who are people who have completely forgotten who they are, and he's going to restore their identity to them. And God's going to use someone from an unexpected place that you would not even consider, who did not even consider himself to be able to do such a thing. Brethren, God knows what you're capable of. Are you willing to do what God wants you to do? Because God can accomplish a lot if you are. And so in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 26 through 29, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on this verse because we're actually going to look at it again tonight. But Paul makes the point that just look out among you, brethren. Just look around. You don't have the best and brightest among you. Don't point fingers, but you can look around. And he says that God hasn't chosen the wisest of the world, the richest of the world, the most notable of the world. God hasn't chosen that characteristic to be the means of salvation. He has chosen the lowly, the son of a carpenter, from a place where people would say, can anything good come out of it? And that's how he had his son brought into the world. And salvation has been brought forth. God does a lot. Because God is willing to take the faith that we have and to develop it and to make it stronger. Then in Hebrews chapter 11, this same Gideon is mentioned along with judges and prophets and kings. When the author says, time would fail me to speak of such people as Gideon and Barak and Jephthah. And so when you think about Gideon, you think about who he thought he was as compared to who God knew he was. And you understand that there's a person that you think you are, but there's a person that God knows you are. Don't belittle what God has created and use it to the full potential of His glory. Gideon's going to take who he is, and he's going to take 300 people, and he's going to make a difference because God is able to take the weaknesses that we sometimes perceive and turn them into great strength. And here we come to Gideon's 300. So in the first two verses of Judges chapter 7, verses 1 and 2, it calls him Jerubbaal. And what it means is contends with Baal, or let Baal contend. What it meant was that Gideon's father in chapter 6 was this idol worshiper. But before Gideon can go out to do battle, he's going to have to take care of things at home first. And so he takes some of his father's oxen. He goes out there and destroys his father's idol. And he rebuilds an altar, but he makes it to God and sacrifices his father's animals upon it. The people are wanting to kill him, but his father steps in and says, if Baal really is a god, then let Baal take care of this. Baal will take care of him. So his name, Gideon, is changed to that because he's the one who did battle against Baal and showed that Baal was nothing and that Baal could not contend with Gideon. They're at this well, Horod. And that word Horod, when you look at it, means fear and trembling. That these people have been going to this well, and a well is a source of life. When you get to the end of chapter 7, you're going to see that many of the wells and springs had been taken over by the Midianites and other princes. And so the Israelites weren't even able to use it. The few springs they had were few springs where the source of life was at. But this source of life was one with fear and trembling. They're having to come out into public, into one of the few places where they could get water and drink. In other words, these people have been living on fear for 40 years. Or for many years. After that 40 years of peace, they have been living on fear. Gideon had been living on fear. Israel had been living on fear. But when he destroyed that altar and he lets the trumpet sound, there are 4 tribes that join with him. I don't know why it's only 4, but there are 4 tribes that join with him. And when these 4 tribes join with him, there are 32,000 troops that he has. In chapter 8, you'll see that the Midianites, after they are destroyed after this battle, there were 135,000 Midianites. So the odds are stacked against him. They're outnumbered 4-1. But what God says is, you know what? You've got too many. Too many. How can you have too many soldiers when you're going into a battle? Wouldn't you want to have more than the enemy? And God says, you already are outnumbered 4-1. Every man among you is going to have to kill 4. But that's too many. Because you're going to boast and say, when you win this battle, that you did this thing. So the question is asked of the people, are you afraid? They see these people as the locusts. Are you afraid? Yeah. And 22,000 leave. Some mathematical expert said that's a reduction in their ranks by over 68%. 68% leave and go back home. 22,000 leave and go back home because they are afraid. But notice 2 things about that. One is that there were that many who showed up, but when it was actually time for battle, went back home. And secondly, the ones who are left, those 10,000 that are left, didn't seem to think that it made any difference because they were still going to go into battle and they were still going to fight. But God still looks at this 10,000 and he says, you know what, that's too many. Okay, 68% are gone. I've only got 10,000. How can this be too many? God says it's too many. So this is what I want you to do. Go down to the water and let them drink. And the ones who get on all fours and they drink from the water with their heads down in the water, you're going to send them home. But the ones who bring up the water to their mouth, in their hand, you're going to keep them. And the ones who got down on all fours and stuck their head in the water were 9,700. 9,700. And God wants them to leave and to go home. There's a lot that's been said about whether or not it mattered. That was this just the way that God decided, because later on they blow 300 trumpets. Maybe that's why he wanted 300, because there was only 300 trumpets available. I don't know. But what I suspect is that it says that God put them to the test. I will put them to the test by this. I do think it mattered the way in which they drank from the water. And you've probably heard it before that the ones who got down on all fours and they put their head to the water, when you put your head down, you can't see the enemy. You can't see what's going on around you. You don't have a good perspective of what's going on. When you watch those National Geographic films, what you'll see when the animals go to the water and they put their head down, one of the others will put his head up. And you see them doing that because it's like, wait, okay, you drink, I'll watch. These people weren't thinking about that. But those 300 kept their eyes upon the horizon. They were able to see the enemy before he got there. They were able to protect themselves and protect others by keeping their heads up. One of the points that I think is significant about this is this. God tells them 9,700 need to go back home. And the 9,700 go back home. They don't murmur. They don't complain. These are people who were brave enough to respond to the initial call. They were brave enough that when they saw the enemy, and Gideon said, if you're afraid, go back home, and they did not go back home. It was only when they were instructed that they had to go back home that they did without murmuring and complaining. I think there's something significant in that, because I don't believe this 9,700 should be thought of as the same way as the 22,000. The 22,000 were afraid. For whatever reason, they were afraid and they left. God can't use them. These were people that you would think God would be able to use, but he needed them to be used in this way. You're not going to be on the battlefield. I think the lesson for that is this, is that not everyone is qualified to do what they desire to do. That these people desired to go into the battle. They were brave enough and strong enough to stay, but they were not the ones that God chose. A good comparison for us would be this, is that there's a lot of men who are strong enough, brave enough, they're smart enough in a lot of areas to be a leader within the Lord's church, but they don't meet the qualifications. It takes just as much faith to serve in that capacity of not being in one of those offices as it does to be one of the ones who does serve in that office. Don't think that you're not special. Don't think that God can't use you. And don't think that you're not valuable in the Lord's kingdom. This is just not the battle you're qualified for. So God has left now Gideon with 300. More than 90% of his army is gone. And God says, I'm going to use this 300 to save Israel. So when you only have 300, you have to be pretty creative. And so God's going to give them a battle plan, but first he tells them, I want you to go down and listen. I want you to go observe the Midianites, and I want you to hear what's being said. So he goes down there, and there's these two men who are talking with one another. He's like, dude, last night I had this weird dream. This loaf of bread comes rolling, I don't know why he's from California, but this loaf of bread comes rolling down the hill, and it demolishes my tent. And the other one says, well, that can only mean one thing. Gideon's going to win the battle. I have no idea how they came to that conclusion. But Gideon did, because Gideon knew that that dream was from the Lord. And so the first thing that Gideon does is he worships God. And he goes to the people and he shouts to the people that this battle is going to be won. God has delivered this people into our hands. We're going to win this battle. And this is how we're going to do it. You 300 men of valor, you 300 men who came to fight, you 300 men who were brave enough, who were looking to the horizon, who knew what it took to win a battle. You're not going to carry a sword with you at all. Instead, you're going to carry a trumpet in one hand, pottery in another hand, that's hollowed out so that you can have a torch inside it. And you're not going to go 300 in force. I'm going to divide you up. And we're going to surround the camp. And when I give the shout, you're going to break the pitcher and light the torches, and you're going to blow the trumpet, and the sword of Gideon and the Lord. That's pretty creative. But that's how God chose to win this battle. Because when that happened, if you remember, the Midianites come out in the middle of the night, terrified of what's going on. They don't know if the enemy and the troops are behind those torches, in front of those torches, if they're even within the camp within them. And so you see someone running by, many of them just took out their sword and killed that person, not knowing who they may be. And by the end of it, you have all but just 15,000 who are killed because of that. This battle was 100% about the Lord and 0% about Gideon and his 300. But it was all about the obstacles that you may have, the fear that you may feel, the trepidation that you may go through, the uneasiness that may be there. Just remember that God is the one who sees more in you than you see in yourself. and that God can use you if you're willing to be used by him, that God can use you. So long as you are not fearful, so long as you don't look at the enemy and say, okay, I thought I was ready for this, but I'm not, and you turn around and flee and go back home. That even if you're the 9,700, that God says, yes, I know that you're willing, but this battle isn't yours to fight. And if you're that 300, you have to have enough faith to not fight with human weapons, but with the armor that God gives. This was all about the Lord and not about the people. I want us to look at one verse before we close. 2 Chronicles chapter 20 and verse 12. There are many examples that you can go through when you read about the kings and the different battles that they went through, but I think there's some things that we see in 2 Chronicles chapter 20 that speak well to what we've been referring to. 2 Chronicles chapter 20. Children of Israel are about to be confronted with the enemy once again. God is giving instructions to Jehoshaphat, who it says in verse 4, who was fearful. He feared, he set himself to seek the Lord and proclaimed a fast throughout all Judah. And notice what he's told in verse 12. O our God, will you not judge them? For we have no power against this great multitude that's coming against us, nor do we know what to do, but our eyes are upon you. Sounds like he's drinking the water from his hand. Our eyes are on you. Down a little bit later in verse 15. Listen, all you of Judah, and you inhabitants of Jerusalem, and you, King Jehoshaphat. Thus says the Lord to you, do not be afraid nor dismayed because of this great multitude, for the battle is not yours, it is the Lord's. So much so that in verse 20, or in verse 17 rather, verse 17, you will not need to fight in this battle. Position yourselves, stand still, and see the salvation of the Lord who is with you, O Judah and Jerusalem. Do not fear nor be dismayed. Tomorrow go out against them, for the Lord is with you. Again, they were willing to be used, and because of that, God brought about a great victory. If there's one verse that I think from this lesson this morning that I think we should all try to memorize for when these scary moments come upon us where we feel outnumbered, when the battle is going to be against a horrific enemy, is Judges 6 and verse 12. The Lord is with you, O man of valor, you mighty man of valor. That we ought to be able to look at ourselves and see that when God sees us, he sees a mighty person of valor. I may not see it, but God does. So the question I'm going to leave with you this morning as we contemplate this is, how would you have drank from that water? I've thought about that. How would you have drank from that water? And the first question is, would I have drank from it at all? Or would I have just turned around and went home? If I had drank that water, would I be somebody who was showing the foresight, the knowledge enough to know that the enemy is around? I need to be watchful. I need to be alert. Because, brethren, as Christians, that's what we're all supposed to be. Am I willing to accept whatever God's judgment is on whatever the situation may be and take whatever course God gives me? It takes great faith to do that when I would like to do different. Whether it's to not go into the battle when I want to, or when I'm in the battle to not pick up a sword, instead to pick up a horn, a trumpet. God is wiser than us, and God brings the victory. We can trust in him. If you're subject to the invitation this morning, if you want to be a child of God, if you want to be part of his army, if you want to be able to fight the battles that God has given to us, God can make you ready. He can increase your faith, and he can get you where you need to be if you're willing. If you're subject, won't you please come as together we stand and sing this song.